Armed groups have killed more than 200 people in several attacks in Nigeria in recent days. The Christian worshippers abducted from churches last month have been released. How serious is Nigeria's security situation, and what progress is being made? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. More than 200 people were killed this week in several attacks in Nigeria, despite government pledges and military resources to deal with armed groups. There was better news for a Christian community in the northern Kaduna state, where the 183 worshippers kidnapped last month returned home safely. The Nigerian government is under pressure both at home and internationally over the security situation. The US took part in attacks last month after claims by President Donald Trump and evangelical church figures that Christians are being persecuted. Nigeria's government strongly denied the allegations, saying that people of all religions have been victims of violence. So, what do this week's events tell us about the security situation? Is it worsening, or is the government making progress as promised? We'll speak to our guests in just a moment, but first a report from Paul Ging.
Several attacks hit Nigeria this week, the worst in Kwara State, where as many as 200 people were killed, with more missing. Most of the population of about 17,000 have fled to safer areas. Survivors say the attackers tied up around 100 people and then shot them at close range.
I can't explain the pain I feel because I can't find 3 of my children. I can't even eat food right now. When the attackers came here, they started shooting sporadically. Everybody ran away and I closed my door.
They torched shops and homes and kidnapped several people, including women and children.
One of my son is abducted. My friend has been killed. And my family, about 12 were killed. So all in all, what we buried now, from yesterday to today, we buried about 178 now, and we are still searching for more.
The attacks follow the announcement that all 183 Christian worshippers abducted from 3 churches last month in northwestern Kaduna State have been freed. It's not clear how their release came about or whether any ransom was paid. The violence is part of a complex security structure in Nigeria, with many competing and overlapping factions. ISIL and Boko Haram operate in the northeast of the country, attacking civilians and security forces alike. Armed gangs operating mainly in the northwest kidnap people for ransom. Farmers and nomadic herders competing for land regularly come into conflict in central regions. And separatist movements operating in the Niger Delta and the southeast have led to long-running unrest in both areas. In December, the US added to the chaos with military strikes against ISIL affiliates.
They're killing record numbers of Christians in Nigeria.
President Donald Trump echoed claims by US evangelical groups that Christians are being targeted. The Nigerian government and Christian groups in the country deny this, saying people of all faiths have been killed. When President Bola Tinubu took office in 2023, he promised economic and security reforms to bring about stability. The latest developments prove that Nigeria remains as far away as ever from achieving this stability. Paul Ging, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. From Lagos, we're joined by James Barnett, a non-resident research fellow at the Hudson Institute, where he focuses on armed groups in Nigeria and the Horn of Africa. Joining us from Dhaka is Ojewale, the regional coordinator for Western Central Africa at the Institute for Security Studies. And from Washington, D.C., we're joined by Melvin Foote, the founder and president of the Constituency for Africa and a specialist on US-Africa policy. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. James, let's start with you. President Tinubu blames Boko Haram for this latest attack. The reality on the ground, though, is far more opaque, as we were hearing in Paul's report. Who do you think is most likely for this attack, and why? What was the motive?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you're right to note that the situation is often incredibly opaque, especially in the northwestern and north central parts of the country, where you have kind of a mixture of different jihadist groups as well as these armed bandit gangs. But in this instance, it does actually seem to have been a Boko Haram network, in particular one led by a kind of notorious commander who's been operating not in the northeast, but in the northwest for the past 5 years, known as Sadiku. And in this case, the militants prior to the attack had actually issued a letter to the community in which they identified themselves as using the term, JAS is the acronym that analysts use, but that's essentially the term that Boko Haram militants use to describe themselves. So there are two main Boko Haram factions in Nigeria, the ISWAP and then the JAS kind of faction. And so in this case, it does seem to have been JAS. And what we know about this Sadiku cell is that they had been based actually in neighboring Kaduna State and parts of Niger State that border Kaduna for several years. But about a year ago, they started actually having friction with some local bandits that they had previously been allied with. And so as part of that, and I think for several other reasons as well, they migrated further westwards into this big forest reserve in Kainji Lake National Park. And so I think as part of their relocation, they've been trying to kind of impose their jihadist rule and preach in some of these rural communities. And so this massacre seems to have been retaliation against that community because they felt that the community was working with the government, working with the military, since the military has been intermittently active in that area, trying to flush out the various groups.
Oluwole, does this attack in Kwara, this atrocity, mark a shift, violence moving into areas that haven't previously seen violence, at least on the scale that we saw over the past few days? Is this part of perhaps a wider regional pattern that you're seeing across West and Central Africa?
Thank you so much for having me. In the central part of the country, for over 2 decades now, there have been a lot of killings that have been going on, and that has been coordinated by various armed groups, but particularly the notorious criminal headsmen who are also in contestations with farmers in those places. So this isn't really new in any way. I think it is the sheer scale that is really causing the rupture now, and coupled with the fact that we are now seeing a convergence of different armed groups, including those ones that have been operating sleeper cells in the Kogi state and the Kwara state for a while now. They've been trying to establish a foothold in those places. But, the modus operandi is that they have two options. It's either they are closer to places where they can drive recruitment to populate their cell, and if they can't do that, then they look for a kind of attack in which they do eat and run, which is like what is happening in the Kwara state in the recent time. This is also coupled with the fact that there is an expansionist agenda on the part of the terrorist groups. Those ones in Nigeria, which James mentioned in his intervention, and those they are coordinating with in Central Sahel, including Lakurawa, GNIM, which has become notorious in the recent time. And the most emboldened attack that the GNIM carried out recently was against a lone soldier in which they carted away with the arms. So I think they found a fortress in Kwara now because of the minimal presence of the state or complete absence of the state in that place, coupled with the fact that they have found a sanctuary in which they can operate logistically and carry out such attacks. But this borders on two things, really. One is the porosity of the Nigeria border, coupled with the fact that in the recent time, the military operation has been creating a kind of dispersal, diffusion, in which those terrorist groups that are operating in the northeast, in particular, and the bandits operating in the northwest, are receiving heavy military operation that is really hitting deep on them. And there's a possibility in which they are now trying to look for a foothold in places that have never really suffered this kind of attack before.
Melvin, Oluwole was talking about the complete absence of state forces in Kwara. The US has condemned this Kwara attack. It's welcomed President Tinubu deploying a battalion of forces there. Washington, though we remember just a few weeks ago, carried out airstrikes in Nigeria. Is US pressure currently helping or destabilizing the situation in Nigeria?
I think the U.S. Policy now is actually helping to destabilize the situation further. One has to realize that a lot of this stuff is rooted in the war on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq. And a lot of it carried on into Libya. And when Colonel Gaddafi was assassinated by us, we didn't protect those weapons. And the weapons out of Libya ended up across the Sahel and destabilized Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and in Nigeria. So part of the problem is a lot of the weaponry that in the region actually was something we should have had a better handle on securing those weapons. I think we're somewhat naive about it. President Trump wants to blame this on Christian terror against Christians, when in fact Muslims alike are also being terrorized by this. So I think the U.S. currently is putting pressure. We're more aimed at looking at the natural resources, the minerals and that kind of thing, and seeing what we could get out of Nigeria as opposed to really solving the problem. So I'm not at all pleased with the administration's approach to this problem. President Trump wants to create conflict within Nigeria because he felt like it would benefit him or the U.S.
James, survivors say the attackers targeted Muslims who were resisting extremist preaching. How does that fit into the argument that this crisis goes far beyond simply a religious narrative? What does it actually tell us about the real nature of Nigeria's security crisis and whether the state is losing control of large parts of the country?
Yeah, well, I think you kind of, you hit it right on the head there, that kind of over the past 10, 15 years, depending on how you want to look at it, the Nigerian state really in many ways has kind of been absent and further kind of accelerated what I would say is an erosion of local governance, an erosion of local security, and different armed groups have taken advantage of that. So while the Boko Haram conflict first kind of reached, astronomical levels of violence, truly kind of horrific massacres and stuff were happening, especially in the kind of early and mid 2010s. At the same time, insecurity was kind of more gradually also deteriorating in the northwestern and parts of the north central regions, where, as Wole alluded to earlier, you have the bandits and you have these conflicts over land and resources and stuff. So it's much broader than just a kind of a religious issue. Even if you're looking at all the different armed groups operating in the country, the jihadists are one component of that. They're a very deadly and dangerous component of that. But many of the armed groups in Nigeria aren't driven by religious ideology. They're driven by profit, grievance, kind of ethnic disputes and issues like that. Even looking at the jihadist groups, though, the Boko Haram movement has fractured and splintered over the years. And now, as Wole was also alluding to, you have groups coming in from the Sahel. So it's very complex because even these different jihadist factions or these different jihadist groups don't all have exactly the same ideology. So, for example, JAS, the group that was responsible for this massacre in Kwara State, traditionally has actually been quite violent, quite extremist against Muslims because they claim that those Muslims are not following their ideology, and so therefore they're enemies of Islam, and they're essentially no different from the Nigerian government. So JAS has conducted a number of many of these massacres against Muslims before. Some of the other groups have tried to adopt a somewhat more you could say kind of a more strategic approach of kind of tolerating, and certain civilian communities, and then, targeting others. So, for example, ISWAP definitely targets Christians, because that's very much part of their jihadist ideology. So it's all to say that kind of, even when you're looking at the jihadists, you can't say that all the groups are the same, and you can't say that their targeting is the same. So, the overall picture, though, is that, Christians and Muslims alike are suffering quite seriously in many parts of the country. Sometimes they're targeted for their faith, and they're targeted by ideological jihadist actors. In other cases, the violence has perhaps other roots to it.
Oluwole, survivors say that security forces were simply not there, absent for hours. Or the police are arguing that they were on the ground. And as we were hearing, the government has sent a battalion to the area now. Nigeria's been under this state of emergency for what? Over a year now. At what point does the inability to protect rural communities like the one in Kwara become a crisis of state authority rather than just what we say on the news all the time? We talk about insecurity.
Well, I think we need to situate this in a long history. You know, the example you mentioned, that at what point did that transformation happen? Whatever is happening in Nigeria now or in the northern corridor of Benin, Togo, and Ghana must be well situated in the state of security in the Sahel. Coupled with the fact that this is rooted in the fall of Gaddafi, which allows arms to roam freely in the hand of different criminal groups. So this has been long coming, coupled with the fact that those places where you mentioned, when we talk about state authority, in the real sense of it, we're talking about two actors principally. We're talking about strong police presence or military forces. And in those places, if you look at the routine criminal operations that are taking place in Nigeria now, and the responses on the part of the state, we have come to the point that the military, which should be an exclusive reserve for strategic operations, have now been deployed to even combating kidnapping for ransom, which I think it's about turning the military to police institution, as it were. And then the police is virtually absent in those places, and places where they are actually present, they have become quite inferior in terms of the sophistication of the criminal groups that are actually attacking these communities. Those are the state of things in those rural communities. And I think if we begin to drive in the direction of a solution now from my own intervention, what this is pointing out are two things. One, we need to address the isolationist approach to security in West Africa now, in which 3 states who have become epicenter of this crisis have actually pulled out of any form of multilateral operation. And if you look at internal operations, there is a need for high-level commitment to security sector reform in Nigeria now. That is what can bring back security to those communities. And it goes in the direction of subnational policing. The military cannot be present in all those places. I'm not even sure if my number is correct, but the entire military force in Nigeria is less than 200,000 personnel. So you can't begin to deploy them to operate like a police force, which we have seen in Nigeria in the recent time. They're in the northeast, they're in the northwest, they're in the southern part of the country where there is oil bunkering and all those things. So the military is extremely stretched. And that is what compounded the crisis in those places. They can't be everywhere. And the obvious solution is to look at how to reform the security sector and bring the police to where it used to be. I grew up in Nigeria, and I know they used to have a mobile police force that was responsible for quelling those communal crises. We don't see them any longer because they have now been turned to VIP protection all over the places. So the more you have more police engaging in VIP protection, the more those rural communities become vulnerable because state presence is going to be minimal or completely absent in those places.
Melvin, 183 Christians were released unharmed after being kidnapped this week. President Trump accuses Nigeria of failing to protect Christians, and yet in the Kwara attack, 200 Muslims were slaughtered. Why do you think they were released unharmed? Was a ransom paid here? Details are pretty opaque. And what should the US be prioritizing right now in terms of its policy towards Nigeria? Good governance, development, intelligence sharing? If it genuinely wants to reduce violence against not just Christians, but it's clear that those of all religions are being caught up in this violence, what should the US be doing?
Well, first of all, I want to congratulate my 2 colleagues. I'm learning all kinds of things on this program myself. I'm taking notes. I think that the U.S. administration is absolutely wrong on Africa. Just about every step they're taking on Africa, be it immigration policy, be it USAID, development policy, everything is wrong as far as the U.S. approach to Africa is today. I think we ought to be talking about all kinds of things. One, we need to be sitting down with the Nigerian government, asking them how we can best help. Certainly, we can help on intelligence. Certainly, we can help making these communities more secure. We should be able to help with food. We should be able to help with relief. We should be able to help with education. We should be able to help in all kinds of ways to assist Nigeria and assist Africa in its development challenges. I just think our whole approach to Africa is wrong. All we hear about is Africa must meet its own share, and Africa must also provide natural resources and that kind of thing if the U.S. is to be involved. America First policy. Many of us who have advocated for Africa over the decades are really dismayed by how the U.S. is approaching the situation. I think also the Africa Union and African ECOWAS and other entities have to step up and be stronger on the scene. The reality is corruption is playing a part of this. I understand that Nigerian intelligence are alerting the terrorists when the Nigerians are actually going to make a move. And so they walk into ambushes and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of work to be done. Some of it needs to be done by Nigeria itself. Then I think outside the United States, the UN and others should be supporting Nigeria to resolve these problems. But the way we're going about it right now is absolutely the wrong way.
James, listening to what you and Oluwole were saying, Nigeria right now faces jihadists, criminal bandits, kidnappers, farmer-herder clashes, and secessionist violence as well. And it's all happening at once. Is there any realistic prospect, do you think, of any kind of single coherent security strategy emerging?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, I think the fact that the insecurity is so complex and of the scale that it is, as you just mentioned, calls for a really serious national security strategy that's not just, a piece of paper, but something that's actually, implemented, something that, there are real reforms that could be made. There are better ways to coordinate efforts between the security agencies. A lot of this will involve or have to involve regional cooperation as well because of the problems with the Sahel. When Nigeria and Niger's relationship rapidly deteriorated in 2023 as a result of the coup in Niger and then the Nigerian government's I think, ill-conceived threats to launch a military operation that then it didn't kind of follow through with. So, the security cooperation on that border, which is Nigeria's longest, has been much less than it should be, although there are some diplomatic efforts to try to improve relations there. The relationship with Benin is also very important because of, as we've seen, this attack in Kwara occurred quite close to the Benin border, where we now have JNIM operating. So it has to be a massive undertaking. And I think that one of my colleagues he was talking about local security efforts, local policing. I completely agree on that, and I would just say that it's a broader problem, though. It's really an issue of local governance, because theoretically in Nigeria you're supposed to have 3 levels of government. You have the federal level, the state level, and the local government level. But in reality, in practice, in much of Nigeria today, you essentially only have those top 2 levels. You have the federal government, you have governors who are, quite influential and powerful in many ways politically. But in many states, a governor can't travel from his state capital to some of these districts without a massive armed escort. And it's because, there's not really local government administration, there's not security presence there, there's not infrastructure. So it is going to have to be a massive undertaking, and there will be military components, non-military components. And I think, we've heard Nigerian politicians over the years talk about this. Yes, we need to commit to this. Some very good and interesting papers and policies have been proposed, but the real challenge is implementation.
Oluwole, picking up on what James was saying there, if nothing happens, what does all of this mean for displacement, for food security, for everyday life, for millions of Nigerians who've been promised for years better security? What would Nigerians recognize as real progress? In Is it just that they feel safe enough to remain in their villages?
There's a need for long-term and short-term solution. The insecurity in the country, the government need to look at addressing those governance deficit issues of out-of-school children, unemployment among the youth. Those are the factors that make people to become vulnerable to recruitment. Those are the long term. But the short term is to really focus on security sector now in terms of reform. One is how much of international support can Nigeria get now, particularly from the global north, whether it is in Europe or in the US, in terms of capacity building, in terms of training and intelligence gathering. I think that is where America should come strongly to the aid of Nigeria now. And the second thing is that the challenges are so overwhelming that you can't rely on foreign import of arms alone. And I think maybe this can be commendable in terms of the emerging conversation between Nigeria and Turkey to build local capacity to be able to produce arms in the short term possible. Okay. But the long run is the fact that the security sector reform must look at bringing back police to local security.
Oluwole, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We're almost out of time. I want to get one more question in for Melvin. Melvin, we heard about condemnation from the United States. The United Nations, the African Union have also condemned the attack in Kwara. What practical leverage, though, does the international community really have here to stop this violence in Nigeria?
Well, for sure, I don't think we ought to be fanning the flames by making this a Christian-Muslim conflict, which clearly is not. It's much more complicated than that. And I think it's a challenging no matter what. But again, you go back to the roots of this conflict and what happened with the war on terror and the residual weapons that got dispersed across the Sahel is a problem. And we're part of that problem. We're the ones who had responsibility there. So I think that it behooves us to sit with the Nigerians and seriously understand what we can do to help. Certainly, USAID has been dismantled, so I'm not sure we can help on the humanitarian side. And I think that that's going to increasingly be a continued way of this conflict exploding. But we have to really sit down with the Nigerians and the governments in West Africa to resolve the problem. We have to be much more in tune with that.
Gentlemen, there we must end it. Many thanks indeed for being with us, James Barnett, Oluwole, Ojewale and Melvin Foote. Thanks for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by visiting the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us on our Facebook page. You'll find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can also join the conversation on X. Our handle there at AJ Inside Story from me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha. Bye for now.